Leadership Agility, 4 Steps to Getting More Done with Less, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by herrmann-nehdi. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour. Now before we begin, note there is a question. It may be labeled as a chat window, and that's usually in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can use this section to send in any questions you have. Submit those throughout the webinar, and then we'll either comment on those as they come in or by email after the session. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I'm in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Our presenter today is herrmann-nehdi. Anne is the CEO of Herrmann International. She is a sought-after speaker who has delivered keynote presentations and educational sessions for associations around the world. A thought leader in her industry, Anne is a member of the Smart Briefs on Workforce Advisory Board, an advisor to the American Creativity Association and Innovation Network, and a faculty member for the Institute of Management Studies. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today, Anne.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I am delighted to be here to talk about a topic that is really at the forefront of almost every conversation I am having with leaders across the globe. And you know when something starts to become a buzzword that it must be top of mind. And so this notion of agility is here. And I think this challenge of getting more done with less is certainly something I know every single one of us is facing almost on a daily basis. So I have a pretty simple agenda to cover today. I'm going to talk a little bit in the beginning here about this agility notion, what's going on there. Whole brain thinking and leadership as it relates to agility, and specifically thinking agility, which is really going to be my focus today. And then I have 4 steps that we believe are essential in order to build that thinking agility and, as a result, get more done with less. So that's really the focus of our session today. So let's get started. I want you to know that there are additional resources. A handout was provided in advance of this session if you'd like to follow along with that. After the session, we have some additional white papers. Many times people want to share some of the core ideas with others. There's a landing page that's part of that handout that you can go to download a copy of the slide deck, as well as some of these other resources, these white papers that will really, in essence, cover much of what I'll be discussing today. So I'd like to start with this quote by C.K. Prahalad, who was a thought leader, really strategic business thinker. And I thought his metaphor was really interesting. You see that there's some Velcro there. And he said it this way: in this volatile world, more and more companies will strive to become Velcro organizations, in which people and capacity can be rearranged and recombined creatively and quickly without major structural change. Now, when you think about this statement, a few years ago, it probably, might have surprised some people to sort of say, what do you mean rearranging and recombining all the time? How do you do that? I would suspect that for most of you listening today, and for many that I work with, this has actually become reality. And the challenge now becomes, understanding, what are the dynamics that are taking us here? And how do we best respond? Now, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this concept of VUCA, but VUCA was actually established by the U.S. Army War College well over a decade ago. And they were seeking to describe the world of the future and what they believed would be some critical factors and forces that would be influencing the way we live. The first one was volatility, and that notion of a volatile world is one that we're kind of experiencing every time we turn on the television, we go online, we see quite a bit of very dramatic change happening in a very unexpected way. And we need to just begin to accept that this is par for the course. It is not going away. That creates a sense of uncertainty, which is also what they felt would be a part of our world today, and I believe this is certainly true. And that sense of uncertainty makes us all, I think, a little bit more challenged in terms of our ability to feel like we can be decisive, to have a better sense of, where we might be headed, and making some of those strategic decisions often get impacted by that uncertainty. And that, too, is here to stay. We've got complexity. Now, I think for me, I know that complicated was something I was pretty comfortable with, but this idea of complexity, which really creates very dense layers of much more work. And just think about how organizations are structured today and the matrix nature of organizations. And people have direct reports not only up and down, but sideways, diagonally, sometimes in directions that they really didn't even realize they were going to have as part of their core relationships. So that level of complexity, as we look at the leadership challenges, not only as relationships are concerned, but also in terms of just the information that we need to be processing, is very real. And then finally, ambiguity in this ambiguous world that we're in means that we really are often looking at fuzzy data and having to make important decisions without all the facts in hand. All four of these, this VUCA environment that we're in, has a direct impact on leaders and also on the organizations that they serve. And so this idea of organizational agility, which of course is part of what's driving the need for leadership agility, can be defined this way: the capability of a company to rapidly change or adapt in response to changes in the market. And I don't know how many of you have been whitewater rafting. That's not a picture of me there, but I've done it quite a few times. And that notion of being able to respond on the fly, think on your feet. Some people like to say see around corners, which is a phrase I think is quite descriptive, is really, really critical. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And when you look at organizations that have a high degree of organizational agility, that helps them react successfully to the emergence of new competitors, new industry-changing technologies, or sudden shifts in overall market conditions. So it is the antidote to this VUCA world that we live in. And of course, organizational agility requires leadership agility. Now, just a few years ago, Forbes, in a really interesting article that's referenced here, estimated that only about 10% of today's employees have the appropriate levels of leadership agility that's needed. Even if that increased by, an additional 50% in the last 2 years, which I'm not sure it has, that's just not enough. So that's why I believe we're hearing more and more talk about not only the challenges that we have in terms of building the leadership pipeline, which most people are facing. As a matter of fact, somebody said to me today, you know what, the war for talent, it's over. And guess what? Talent won. So we're going to continue to see that. But then, in addition, we need leaders who are able to flex with the situation. As Warren Bennis, who's written on leadership for several decades, says, to grow and transform, executives, and I would say all leaders, have to have extraordinary adaptability. So, so as we look at that, how do we define thinking agility? Thinking agility is the ability to consciously shift your thinking when the situation requires it. Now, that means that you're shifting your thinking all day. You encounter a different kind of an email, a phone call comes in. Our brains are reactively shifting our thinking. But in many instances, and you may not know this, our brains are actually pretty lazy. And we kind of go into unconscious mode much of the time so that we can be very efficient. So when we see something coming at us, the brain will typically react, and if it's something we've seen before, we react in the way that we reacted in a previous time, and that may or may not be exactly what we need. So let's take a moment to do a poll. I'm going to launch this in just a second, but to give you a moment to think about it, I'd like you to think about the greatest challenge you have in developing agile leaders, either for your organization or for one of your client organizations. Is it lack of leader energy to engage in having them stretch? Is it conflicting priorities in this issue of just trying to get it all done? Have we not defined agility as a critical competency? Or is it a constantly changing vision of what the future needs are for leaders? So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And I'd like you, if you would, to select one. You may say that's more than one, but go ahead and select one of those, if you would. Which one do you think is the greatest challenge for you, or the greatest hindrance or obstacle as you think about those that you're working with, either internally or for an external client organization? I'm going to give you just a few more seconds to finish that up. I'll be interested to see if you are in alignment with other groups who I've asked the same question to, and see how that is going. We'll give you just about 3 more seconds. So place that vote in if you would, so we can close this out. 1, 2, 3. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share the data. So as you see that, interesting, this is absolutely consistent with what I've seen before. 59% of you said conflicting priorities and getting it all done. That's why this idea of trying to get more done with less is so pervasive. Now, I would contend that we set ourselves up for those conflicting priorities, so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And then pretty equal lack of leader energy and that learning to stretch. They kind of just don't know even how to find the energy to do that. Or agility really not being defined as a critical competency. And so it's sort of like, well, I'm not even sure this is on my list. It's not on my development plan, etc. And then the changing vision of future needs for leaders. Now, in some organizations, that's the issue, and that's why we haven't defined agility as a critical competency, because we haven't really taken the time to think about what future leaders might need. So thank you very much. That was very helpful. So as we look at that, I want you, if you would, to note the color of the selection that you made. Just jot that down. Which one did you pick? And we'll come back to those colors in just a moment. So which was the one that you selected, and what color was it? Well, so when we look at this issue of leadership development, I thought this was a fascinating article in McKinsey not too long ago, just at the beginning of this year, around why leadership development programs fail. And we've all seen that happen. And there were, 4 primary reasons McKinsey felt that they fail. One was overlooking context, that notion of understanding the context of the real world that the leader lives in, and kind of creating a program that really doesn't fit that context. Connected to that is the decoupling reflection from real work, and really kind of having leaders go off and reflect around something that may not be able to serve their day-to-day work world in a very specific and direct way. Failure to measure results, and so we don't even know how well a program is doing if we're not measuring it. And underestimating mindsets, which I found to be particularly relevant to today's topic, because mindset is one of the biggest barriers, I believe. Our mindset drives what we see, and it's part of that unconscious part of our brains where we just sort of look at the world, we've got our patterns, and we look at it. Now, if you would just type into the question box what it is you see on the screen. So what is it? It sounds like an obvious question. What is it that you see on the screen? How would you describe what it is that you see on the screen? Okay, and so I'm seeing all sorts of, it's okay, a world map of the world, absolutely. It's a global perspective. And I believe that's how the world looks. I was down visiting our partners, our global partners down under a few years ago, and they were nice enough to give me a gift. And that gift was an alternate view of the world and how they saw the world, which was quite a different way than the way I saw the world. Sarah, trying to get that to advance. I'm hoping that it will. There we go. And so you can see that that their view of the world had down under in a completely different location. We were down under, and that was their mindset. And they said, who are you to say that we're down under and that the top of the world is there? In space, I'm not so sure there's a top and a bottom. So somebody just decided that that's how it would be. So mindset defines how we look at the world. And, of course, our brain is at the source of our mindset. As we look at the brain, it's craving patterns. And the reason it's craving patterns is our patterns make things more efficient. And it's constantly searching for a pattern, because when you look at any given situation, you can say, seen that before, know how to deal with it, boom, and you can deal with it immediately. And it takes a lot less brain energy to do that. And I tell you, in today's environment, we're doing that more and more. We're so reactive just because of the sheer amount of things that we're dealing with. So, the good news is that can be very helpful. See if you can read what's on the screen. So I'm suspecting, as most of my audience, is that you can read pretty easily what's on the screen, even though there's a kind of a mix of letters and numbers, and you might not even, it's kind of a creative way for somebody to deal with the fact that they don't have the full alphabet. And our brains, because we're so good at patterning, actually can fill in the blanks. So that's the good news. Here's another example. So if you would, just say out loud to yourself what this says, and if you'd like to type it into the question box, you can. Can you read, even though we're covering up half of what this is, are you still able to read what is on the screen? Okay, and you're all getting it. Absolutely, good times are here. And I would suspect that most of you are pretty sure that that's what it says. And then as you look at what it actually says, and I'm just going to go ahead and cover that back up so you can see it again, right? Actually, it says something quite different. So here, the good news is the patterning helps us make sense of things when we've seen it before, but it also can be very misleading. So we may look at half of the data and say, got it, and when, in fact, we could be quite wrong. So as we look at that issue of patterning, we're going to do a quick little bit of mental floss. I'm going to play a little card game. I don't know how many of you like to play card games, but I enjoy that from time to time. And I'm going to ask you, if you would, I'm going to put up a card, and I'm going to put up a slide for just a few minutes. There'll be several cards on the screen. I want you to focus on one, and then I'll perform my magic trick. Okay? So I want you to pick one and focus on it. Focus on it so much that you can almost see it in your mind's eye. So if you closed your eyes, you could actually see it. Okay? So just pick one. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Okay? Ready, set. All right. Pick one. Focus on it. Close your eyes and see if you can see it. Okay? Now, I'm going to magically remove the card that you selected. Let's see if I can do that. I'm going to put those up. So do you see your card? All right. So go ahead. If anybody says that they see their card, you can type that in. But I don't think, let's see, is there anybody who sees their cards? No, you're all saying no, absolutely not. Why? Why? Why do you think you don't see? I did, yes, I changed all the cards. That's right. Now, by asking you to focus on one card, I created a very specific pattern and sort of seduced many of you into just looking at one card. And so, although some of you did pick up on the fact that I changed all of them, it's very easy for the brain to get sucked into a focus piece that creates a pattern that becomes the way we look at the world, becomes a mindset. So this mindset thing is very pervasive. And as this is a great example, John Medina, who wrote the book Brain Rules, and those of you who are really interested in the brain can Google Brain Rules and get most of that book online. He says it this way: if you're leading a modern corporation, you need to know how brains work. And I believe you need to know how brains work, but very specifically, and what do I do about that? Practically, what can I do? How do I use that information? So we've been looking at that, and I actually grew up with a father who was interested in the brain over 30 years ago, and wired me up to an EEG for testing after school. Some people say that explains how I turned out. I don't know. And out of that initial research, was able to understand that we have clusters of preference, thinking self-reference, that really form a pattern for each of us as we look at the world. And so not having to wire people up was certainly one of the objectives. And what we learned from looking at the whole brain thinking model is that we have, each of us has access to that upper left blue logical, analytical, and fact-based quantitative aspect. If we are, that might be someone who is, more in the financial field or in a technical field. And somebody's asking, can you explain the card trick again? Yeah, all I did with the card trick was I put up 6 different cards, and then I had you pick one, and then I took all of those away and put up 5 totally different cards. So that's exactly what I did. So that's the trick. I'm giving it away. Most magicians don't do that, but I'll give mine away. So we all also have access to that lower left green B quadrant, organized, sequential, planned, and detailed. And we can structure, but think about the people who you know who are much more focused on quality assurance, for example. They're very good at organization and detail, process, and administrative kinds of tasks, manufacturing. You'll have lots of that preference in those domains, but all of us have it. Over on the right side of the model, that lower left C, it's that interpersonal, feeling-based, kinesthetic, emotional aspect of who we are. And we all have that, and many of you in the training field have got a strong preference for that kind of thinking. And it defines kind of what you pay attention to. It's why you have such a strong passion for working with people. And then last but not least, that upper right yellow D quadrant, holistic, intuitive, integrating, and synthesizing, is a big part of that more conceptual side of who we are. You'll find that lots of people who do work in strategy, people who do work in brand, entrepreneurs have a very strong preference there. So we all have access to all four, and we know that we have preferences for some over others. So we can look at things from all different perspectives, but when we start to look at the occupational choices that we've made, and we measure this using the HBDI, the Herrmann Brain Dominance Instrument that was developed as a result of that initial research, which actually was done at GE in its initial phases, we see that typical occupations have got different tilts, but we all have all four. And you might be thinking about the implications of those that you train. So if you would, type in the box the quadrant A, B, C, or D, or quadrants that you think best represents your audience's strongest preferences. So is it blue, A, B, C, or D? Blue, green, red, or yellow, A, B, C, or D? And what do you think? Where are they? Are they across all four? Are they primarily in two quadrants? Okay, so I'm seeing lots of combinations of A and B, blue, green, okay? Lots of you are saying lots of green. So what's really important is to understand where they're coming from a mindset perspective. As a trainer, you really need to think about what it is they're looking for and how they need to learn. And many of you are saying you have an audience across all four, which means, of course, you need to be agile in your thinking about how you deliver learning in a way. We have a whole category of research and content on learning design, but as you think about the leaders that you might be working with, their learning needs are going to be quite different. And when you look at C-level executives, what's really interesting is that they tend to be more whole brain than anybody else as one single occupational category, and that's because the work requires it. They actually have to situationally address the business needs, focus on results, the needs of getting operations to work and execution, the needs of understanding people issues, customers, etc., and then finally strategy, big picture, and brand. So as you look at that, understand that as we're looking at leadership, we believe, and our research has shown, that leaders need all four perspectives in order to be results-oriented, which is part of what being agile is today. You've got to deliver results. You've got to drive performance. You've got to focus on engagement. And you've got to be strategically agile. So all four are important. We have access to all four. So how do we do this? Now, 16 of the 25 of this is the most recent Aon Fortune study of the top companies for leaders. The latest report should be out soon. 16 of the 25 on that list are applying whole brain thinking to their leadership challenges. So this is a really great mechanism for actually building in that flexible thinking, or as we're calling it now, agility. So let's look at how you do that. There are four specific steps, and of course everything always ends up being an acronym, right? So let's consider this the saga, the leadership saga that we all need to engage with. And I'd like you to be thinking not only about yourself as I'm talking about this, but also the leaders that you serve. So SAGA stands for solve, align, grow, and adapt. Much of the leadership challenge will fall into one of those four categories. All four of them require whole brain thinking. So let's talk first about solve. I'm a big Rubik's Cube fan, and you think about the leadership challenge, boy, I tell you, it is, solving is a big part of what is happening in today's environment, and often solving challenges that we never even knew could actually occur. And Albert Einstein, oft quoted, says it this way: the world we've created is a product of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. So if we're looking to solve some of the challenges of today's new world, of today's VUCA world, we've got to change our thinking. And we're partnering with some folks at Stanford University in the D School and the Center for Design Research doing some fascinating research. And in particular, one of the questions that they were exploring was, why are there so few engineers in the C-suite? What do you think? Why do you think there's so few engineers in the C-suite? Just speculate, throw in an idea or two into the question panel. What do you think? Why do you think there would be so few engineers? And I love engineers, so this is nothing against engineers. Somebody's saying, oh yeah, well, I think there's a little bit too much blue. Okay, absolutely. Engineers do have, they're very technical. Often they don't have as much of the people skills, etc. And when you look at solving problems, engineers are actually trained to solve problems. They're trained to look at a process, and they do it in a very analytical way. And one of the things that they found in this research is that engineers tend to seek the best answer versus a variety of solutions. Now, it's not just engineers that struggle with this. Most of us have been trained, and just think about your own education. When you've got a problem, you say, well, what is the answer? When you think about mathematics, when you think about most of the problems that we have, kind of growing up through the course of our education, there is an answer, and there's a right answer. Today's environment is not about a right answer. You have to seek a variety of solutions, or you find yourself in a situation where you may only have one answer, and you get totally caught off guard when, under a little bit more review, and remember, good times are here, we realize that, in fact, the problem is much more complex than we thought it might be. And that, I'm sure, has happened to you, and I know it's happened to me, and you sort of think, oh, I've seen this before. Here's the right answer, and then boom. So having a variety of solutions is a great way to go. And one of my favorite people, who was a leader of Perfetti Van Mel, I don't know, raise your hand if you like Mentos. Mentos is a great candy. I don't know who today likes Mentos, but a lot of people I know really love it. And Perfetti Van Mel creates one of their core products is Mentos, among other products. And working with them, the then leader, GM, Ronald Korkhoff, had a great way of applying whole brain thinking. He basically said, you know what, I'm going to require a whole brain walk around. And in any given situation, I require that anybody looking at a given problem address the 4 Qs. Those 4 Qs were what, how, who, and why. And inevitably, someone might pop into his office and say, you know what, here's a problem, here's my recommended solution. And he would say, have you done the 4 Qs? And if they hadn't, he said, come back when you've done it. And what he found was that this significantly reduced some of the misses that they might have had in some of their problems. And then, and when we look at the complexity of today's environment, that breadth of thinking. So it's a very simple tool you can use to help leaders actually, walk around the quadrants, stretch their thinking. Just asking those 4 questions really, really worked. Now, another interesting thing that's part of our world today as we think about solving is that there are lots of constraints. So what are the constraints that your leaders are experiencing? Just type that in, if you would, into the question box. What are the sorts of constraints that your leaders are encountering? I'm curious to hear what you think. Okay, so time is obviously a big one, and you're probably experiencing that as well. Listening, limited resources. I know we just never have enough budget, not enough direction. Gosh, we've got conflicting priorities. Politics, oh yeah, that's one of my favorites. Not enough support. So, and in the world of creative thinking, which is also part of our legacy, one of the things you learn right away is, rapid evolution of technology is a huge one, is that you can either look at constraints as obstacles, which is a mindset, or you can flip it around and say, how do I use the constraint as a way to get more creative? And as you look at that, I'm going to give you a quick example here, because this is an example of solving a problem. What problem do you think we were solving here? We actually solved a problem here. This was a problem, and this is actually solving it. So what problem do you think we're actually solving in the visual that you see on the screen? Here the constraint was that, we had a broken bulb. Yes, we had a broken bulb. All right, so that was the problem. The constraint was we couldn't get the bulb out without cutting our hands, because the way it broke was such that we couldn't actually get it out. So that was a constraint. And so when you look at a constraint, you say, so how might I think about this differently than the way I normally would solve it? Then you can then begin to see that as an actual asset. And in a lot of creative problem-solving approaches, you actually focus on constraints because they prompt your thinking away from your traditional problem-solving solutions. So constraints are a gift. So another way to better solve problems is to use them as an asset. So you want to teach your leaders to solve by seeking a variety of solutions, using a whole brain approach to be better prepared for constant change, saving time by applying the 4Q approach as they work with themselves and with others, and seeing constraints as opportunities for new thinking and to accelerate solution building. So the other section that we want to talk about is alignment. And I tell you, this alignment thing, it really impacts all facets of an organization. You know, and as we look at alignment, you know, our preferences have a huge impact on how we understand and connect with and often misalign with others. And so one of the things I recommend that people do is they do some relationship mapping. Because, you know, critical relationship leaders have, one of their core jobs is to manage critical relationships, those that they must be influencing. And as you can see from this little diagram, those relationships are much more complex than they used to be. It used to be pretty straightforward. Just take a moment to think about your relationships. And I encourage you, as a result of today's session, if you just take a few moments after the webinar and just take a blank piece of paper and think about all the critical, and it's useful to do both personal and professional, all the critical internal and external relationships that you need to make sure you're managing well, influencing well, understanding well in order for you to be successful. That will significantly help your agility. And as we look at that, you begin to understand the preferences and the differences of preferences of each of those folks. You can then begin to say, how do I first understand how they think? What kind of information do they need? How do they learn? How do your leaders need to learn? And as you're looking at that notion of building a relationship map, you can then be much clearer and much less random about the way that you need, what you need to do in order to align. Because ultimately alignment is about understanding their needs, looking at your needs, and then finding a way to build the bridge between it. And this is an example of a bridge, which is kind of a weird one, but it's a communication bridge, which is one of the most important tools in looking at alignment, even though that's kind of a weird way of showing it. And let's take a look. I'm just going to test your understanding of the model a little bit. So if we were communicating, so here's, I'm going to show you 4 different ads. And those ads are seeking to reach a given quadrant audience. So which quadrant audience do you think this ad is seeking to reach? I've got 4 different airline ads, so type it in. Okay, so we're focused on company dividends, all right, and growing the business. All right, so I'm seeing a whole lot of blue quadrant, yeah, finance, growing, ROI, etc. Might be a tad of green in there, but a lot of that is very, very blue. Absolutely. So that's going to have a strong focus on blue with maybe a little bit of green. What about this one? This is another airline ad. Why your mother would prefer you to fly Qantas. And there's Mom, and she's looking at us. You know, that's kind of an interesting look, I think, that Mom is giving us, and she's sitting there in the kitchen. All right, yes, and so it's the red C quadrant, the bottom right. Okay, very different way to talk about looking at communicating about a similar service, which is an airline service, right? Now, here's another one. This was the entire ad. This is the whole ad. And again, it's an airline. It may take you a minute to figure out which airline if you look closely. And you see a person sitting there, and they're in a museum, and they're thinking, and there's art on the wall. And so what do you think? Why? Many of you are saying yellow and red. Red's all about the culture piece. And, of course, yellow is all about, you have to kind of infer why they're a great airline. They're about culture, about taking you to wonderful places, about giving you an opportunity to dream, right? So you see a lot more yellow in that particular ad. And then finally, this Lufthansa ad that has quite a bit of detail on it that says, you know, we're here for you. We've got exactly what you need no matter where you're going. And, of course, we've covered all the quadrants, and so many of you are deducting quite appropriately that that's a lot more green. So 4 very different ways to try to align with a prospective customer. You have customers. Your leaders have customers. And in many instances, they might be on a team. Now, I will confess that this is one of my favorite cartoons. And that's one of my favorites because I think it's kind of making fun of sometimes what we do as trainers, and I include myself in that. TEAM, together everyone annoys me. So raise your hand if you're on a team yourself. Just raise your hand if teaming is something that you actually do. Raise your hand if you would. How many of you are actually on a team? I see many of you are part of a team experience and, and recognize what this is like. Yeah. And I'm sure your leaders are working with teams. Now, raise your hand if you work with teams. Some of you may be facilitators of teams. And so you experience lack of alignment almost on a daily basis if you're trying to facilitate. As a matter of fact, that's often what you're brought in to do, right? So this notion of teams is really critical as we look at a leader's role. And sometimes we've got everything from, I met a leader the other day who basically said to me, he was sitting there doing performance reviews on a flight. And I said, we were chit-chatting, and I said, so you're pretty hard at work. And he said, yeah, I'm really struggling because I never have met these people face-to-face. And frankly, most of them I only know by email, and here I am doing a performance review. It's really a struggle, and so on and so forth. So his ability to even just align with the folks who were on his team was certainly a challenge. Now, when you look at our data, interestingly enough, let me just ask this group. How many of you have been on a team where people pretty much think in the same way? Describe in the question box what that was like. So, like the example on the left of the screen, similar thinking, more or less. You're kind of exquisitely all together, all aligned. It's like, okay, you just get together, you talk, other people are finishing each other's sentences. Okay, so yeah, not always creative. Often this can be very easy. I was working with a group, and they said, you gave us 2 weeks. We got it done in 3 days, man. We know what we need to do. No problem at all right? And it's interesting because if you look at that, you feel like, I love this, a false sense of true synergy, like, hey, we're all aligned, this must be the right thing. When in fact, lots of times that's actually really a false sense because you may be overlooking some things, correct? Now, how many of you now, talk to me a little bit about what it was like to be part of a more whole brain group, a group of differences. What was the process like there? How was that different than maybe being in a group that was quite similar, or facilitating a group that was quite similar? Okay, so yeah, things like being much more stimulating, lively. I love this, annoying but better results. Struggles but getting lots done, lots of different ideas, a different kind of energy and creativity. And what's great about your answers is I'm hearing both frustration and better results. We did a study some years ago looking at, it was a 6-year study with the U.S. Forest Service. We studied diverse whole brain groups, and we saw that they are up to 66% more effective than non-whole brain groups. And here are a few of the reasons that they were more effective. One is that they had a multi-dominant thinker who helped the group align. So if you are facilitating a group, or a leader is leading a diverse group, which is happening more and more in today's environment with cross-functional teams, that notion of the ability to align, not by necessarily having the same thinking, but by being able to translate and help people build bridges between their differences so that you get a much more creative output. That is actually when things really work. And our data has shown that whole brain groups create significantly more creative output, and many of you acknowledge that. And so as you look at that, the good news is many of the groups that we work with are quite diverse. The challenge is helping them align, using an understanding of that difference and how it adds value to any given situation is critical, and really making sure they understand that alignment is going to be key. It takes more time, but it's worth it. Fred Keaton, who's a partner of ours for many years, has done great work at Caesars, and he likes to define it this way. He says, cognitive diversity allows us to configure teams that generate superior economic value by generating better solutions to real business problems. So one of the things he likes to say to his groups is, look, this is harder. This is not the easy route, but we have tough business problems. We're going to put the right brain power against the tough challenges that we're seeking. He calls them D by D teams, diverse by design. So you might think about ways that you can position this as saying, you know, even though I think it's not fair to say to people this is easier or just get over it, it is a lot harder. It requires more patience. It requires more time. It requires much better communication, much greater facilitation. And if you have a whole brain thinker in the group, they will naturally play a translator role. So you want to help them in that process. Microsoft, I don't know if any of you are Connect players with the Xbox. We worked with Microsoft on their inbox game and their team, and they had basically, they had 14 months to get 24 months worth of work done. And by applying whole brain thinking, they call it good science, to their product development process, they were able to reduce the amount of time by 40% and hit the holiday launch date. Pretty significant. So this stuff really works, and it gives you an ability to really provide greater results. So you want to map key relationships so they can better align to get more done. And you yourself want to be doing this with your learners, and you want to help your leaders do that as well. It's important to meet other needs first to accelerate and improve communication. So often we communicate in the way that we think is just such an effective way to communicate. We all know that. And I think, you know, this is that classic, not the golden rule. You don't communicate like you like to communicate. You communicate like others need to be. I think some people call that the platinum rule. And then finally, you want to build whole brain diverse teams for more efficient results and greater creativity. And when you don't have a whole brain team, then you have to have people situationally stretch into those areas that might be lacking. Or you might find some external resources who can help with that. All right, growth. Growth is one of the most important here as we think about leadership development, and I think you would probably agree. I stumbled upon this quote from Deming, who's one of my favorites, just the other day, and I was reminded about the power of his thinking. He said, "It's so easy to do nothing. It's a challenge to do something. Learning is not compulsory, it's voluntary. But to survive, we must learn." And growth is one of the most important roles of a leader, and yet they have less time than they have ever had in today's world to actually do it. And so as we look at that, here's the good news. The good news is the brain actually changes through learning. Now, believe it or not, there were hundreds of years of dogma around how the brain basically stopped growing. You know, first they said, well, it's at age 6 it stops, and then 10, and then 15, and then 20. And now they realize that you still have synaptic connections occurring even in the adult brain, even later in life. Now, they function in different ways. They're not maybe as speedy as they were when you were 7 years old, but we still are having that impact. As a matter of fact, you, as a training professional, you are helping those connections form. So even old dogs can learn new tricks. I guess it's a message of hope for all of us. So I believe we need to rethink the way we look at leadership development. And I could speak for, you know, days on this topic. But rather than just think, I think we need to rethink. And we need to rethink the competencies that we need. Rethink the way we're delivering leadership development. Look at the growth needs of our leaders. Look at the reality of their world. Look at what they need on the job. What is their true context, as we saw earlier from the McKinsey study, and understand what they need before, during, and after to actually have that growth experience. And we all know it doesn't happen in kind of what a friend of mine used to refer to as the sheep dip approach, where we just basically send somebody off to a program and, you know, hope that it all sticks. In particular, I think we need to rethink the competencies that they need to be focused on. We saw earlier that maybe agility wasn't the core competency that some people were focusing on. And as we look at IBM, we've worked with IBM for many years as part of their Emerging Leader program. They actually began to look at the competencies within the context of preference so that they could be more effective in terms of people understanding what the competency actually meant and how they could stretch their thinking. No cop-outs, no cop-out rule. We know everybody can stretch their thinking. I'm a big believer in strengths, but the world around us does not allow us to just be strength-focused. And I believe that you want to leverage your strengths, but you absolutely have to assume responsibility for those blind spots that we inevitably have. And as Dee Hock from Visa International said so aptly, if you seek to lead, you need to invest at least 50% of your time leading yourself. And I think we have a job. We have a job to help our leaders understand that that is part of their role. And there's some challenges that we're facing. We've got an attention span issue that I think is very real. I thought this was pretty funny. I think 3 minutes and 27 seconds is actually a pretty long attention span. We're finding ourselves multitasking. You know, and I think that's it's interesting to think about how much. This is actually an example in the UK where they did a test to pad the poles because people were actually running into the street poles because they were walking. At least they were on the sidewalk, walking into the poles. Raise your hand if this has ever happened to you. Raise your hand if this has ever happened to you. Have you ever sort of walked into something, almost walked into something, tripped, had something like that happen, where you found yourself kind of going, you know, you were trying to do this. You were trying to multitask, right? And I see many of you are willing to confess. Okay, now, I'm going to really get in your face right now and ask how many of you are multitasking right this minute. I want you to tell me in the question box how many of you are multitasking. Just type yes. Stop multitasking for a moment and type yes in the box. And boy, I can tell you, okay, a few people, thank you, are saying no, yes, and no, yes, yes, yes. Okay, so see how many of you are doing that? So this is true. This is true. So many people are spending their time multitasking. And Linda Stone did some fabulous research on continuous partial attention. We do not have full attention when we're multitasking. It is not always the best choice. As a matter of fact, you can have a 50% increase in errors, and it can take 50% longer to complete the task. And so we get a little squirt of dopamine when we do this. Our brains love it. We get very excited when we get that little ding of a new email coming in, or we jump off and look at our Facebook, you know, how many people have like reacted to something, or whatever it might be. So our brains get seduced in. This is one of the biggest impediments to productivity. And even though younger generations may be a bit faster at it, our brain is literally a serial processor. It cannot function at its greatest effectiveness. The best you're going to get is that unconscious patterned reaction when you are in a multitasking mode. So don't kid yourself. Now, is it realistic to say you're not going to multitask? Absolutely not. But don't kid yourself into thinking you're going to be as effective. And guess what? Raise your hand if you know when you're talking to somebody else that they're multitasking. How many of you can tell that somebody's not paying attention to you? And this happened with me and with my spouse, like actually maybe once or twice, where, you know, and maybe you're in the middle of a conversation, you realize, oh my God, I didn't hear the last 2 minutes of that conversation. And it's like, oh my God, what do I do? All right, so you can tell when somebody else isn't listening. They know when you're doing it. So leaders have to know this, because this is an anti-engagement strategy. I think multitasking is one of the worst offenders in terms of looking at engagement. Another offender is not having not to-do lists. We have lots of to-do lists, but we must have not to-do lists. And not to-do lists are pretty easy to build. We really need to help leaders let go. It's much easier for leaders to take things on than to let them go. I would like you to be thinking yourself, what is one thing you can put on your not to-do list? I realized the other day that I was reviewing a report weekly that I really didn't need to see anymore. And, you know, it was just out of sheer habit. It was on my calendar. I did it every single week. And it was like, why am I doing this? And I was on automatic once again. So, you know, we need to help our leaders do that. Now, let's take a moment to do another quick poll. I want to ask you what you think is the most important area for your leaders to focus on. And so we're going to, you know, as you look at those, what might be the most important area for your leaders to focus on? And I'm going to launch the poll. And I'd like you to answer this, if you would. Is it social, emotional, and cultural intelligence, collaboration, focus while managing priorities, execution, and quality, results-driven problem solving, analytical thinking, or flexible, innovative, and strategic thinking? Which one is it? I'm going to give you a chance. Pick one, if you would. The number one area that you think is lacking as you think about, boy, we'd love them to be more agile, and in particular, we'd like them to stretch in this particular area. So opportunity for you to put down whatever you're multitasking and answer the poll if you would. Okay, I'm going to give you a few more seconds. I see the votes are still coming in. All right. Okay, very good. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so we'll look and see what you said. Social, emotional, and cultural intelligence and collaboration. Wow. Okay, so what we were just talking about in that alignment issue is so important. That was number 1. Number 2, flexible, innovative, and strategic thinking, not different from what I'm hearing with all the organizations we work with. Focus while managing priorities, execution, and quality. I think there's a reason why we continue to see books on execution that are quite successful. And then results-driven problem-solving, analytical thinking. Chances are they're already doing that pretty well, right? So not a big surprise there. Okay, so we got a sense, again, pay attention to the color of your selection. Again, it links back to that notion of the quadrants and what we've been talking about with the quadrants. So you want to help your leaders grow by helping them rethink their competency needs to better fit today's demands. What is it that we really need? Are there competencies that are just not as important? Are there competency development skills that have just been sitting around in our program all these years? Or it's there for political reasons? Or it's there because, I don't know, we don't even know why it's there. Scheduling time to think free of multitasking. I actually block time on my calendar as thinking time. And, that means you have to turn off email, you have to shut down, make sure your phone is off, and, and people will respect that time. If you want deep thinking, really high-quality thinking time, and you want to say 50%, then you can actually do that by protecting thinking time. And then creating not-to-do lists so that they can unload tasks that are no longer necessary, and that applies to you as well. Okay, last but not least, adapting. Adapting, I love this quote. The pessimist complains about the wind. The optimist expects it to change. The realist adjusts the sail. So this is about adjusting the sail. What is it that we need to do? So you think about that notion, we don't hesitate to find an adapter when we're traveling internationally, right? So we know we need to adapt. I think that might not always be quite so clear when we think about the changing environment that we're in. We need to think about what our toolkit might be. And what we know is that time is half of what we had before. I did some work with Apple some years ago, and it was very interesting. They basically have a very limited amount of time to design the training for their new product releases because there's quite a bit of secrecy inside of the organization for brand reasons around new releases. And so, can you imagine that if you only had 2 days to design and launch a training initiative for something that might be quite new? So they called that radical design. I think if you were to assume that you have half the time, you would be a lot better off, half the money. And then remember that issue of having constraint as an asset? You can then think about new ways. It'll help you get out of that mindset of like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Because chances are you'll have half the money, the people, the resources, and the time. So adapt by planning for it. Cut it in half, and then get creative around what it is that you're going to do. It's a much better mindset for adapting. Another great lesson we can learn from Julia Child is, have a mindset of experimentation. She flipped a potato on TV, and it landed on the floor. The only way you learn to flip things is to just flip them. And that means you have to be more playful. Start small. If you keep failing in small ways, you'll keep learning. And you want to stay playful because if you're afraid to make mistakes, it makes it harder to adapt. So this notion of playfulness, this notion of being ready for adapting is really key. And then another kind of mind hack that's very helpful for adapting is the constant question. You want to constantly be asking questions. And one of the biggest questions you want to have on your forefront, I actually have this on the wall in my office, is what if? What if? And if you're constantly asking yourself that question, you will be ahead of the curve. You can see around corners. You'll be ready to adapt. Because leaders need to situationally step into different modes to be prepared for new situations. And reminding yourself of that is a much better preparation than getting caught off guard. We hate adapting because it catches us off guard. So you want to help your leaders adapt by cutting it in half so that you can keep ahead. Getting more ideas by adopting an experimental mindset and getting, playful around that. Having some fun. It's hard to do that when you're stressed out, but if leaders aren't doing it, chances are nobody in the organization is doing it. And most people would prefer to have fun if they could. So it's an interesting idea. And then asking what if to save time by avoiding the surprises that might sneak up on you and catch you off guard. So think about this from a saga perspective: solve, align, grow, and adapt, all of them requiring a whole brain perspective. I can guarantee that if you understand the thinking preferences at the table, if you understand both your own and you help your leaders better understand how they can better navigate this mental complexity that we're in today's world, they will build that agility. We all have that capacity to build it. We just need to help them understand that. So basically, for best results, you need to use this daily, not let yourself go into that unconscious, sort of flatline, mindset patterning that we often will do. And what this does is it helps leaders avoid this. Again, one of my favorite cartoons, oh crap, was that today? And that, my friend, is what happened to the dinosaurs. And so take a moment. What takeaways do you have as a result of today's session? I would like you, if you would, to just type into the question area, and I'll read off a few of those because I think sometimes people learn from each other's takeaways. So what? What are you going to do? How will you be more agile in the way you work with leaders? What are one or two things that you can immediately apply? Take more chances, play, cut it in half. Have a not to-do list, great. Perception is critical, pay attention to that. Google brain rules, very good. Ask more questions, focus on the what if. Saga to daily activities. It's a great model for just framing up, what do I need to be doing in this moment? Stop multitasking, good for you. Or at least reduce that. Look at constraints. Use constraints as a way to focus differently. Incorporate what if into every aspect. Actually look at the 4 Qs. Think outside my comfort zone. That's a great one. And, I have a great mentor who said to me once when I was complaining, Ann, I'm glad you're uncomfortable. And I said, why? And he said, because discomfort is a sign of learning. You should be excited about it. Map out relationships. That's great. Turn barriers into assets. Reduce the multitasking. That's probably pretty realistic. Build that not-to-do list. So here's the deal. You can leave today's session sort of going, that was interesting, that was entertaining, that was informative, or you can actually do something. I suggest one of the best ways to think about how you can help other leaders do this is to apply it yourself. To take on your own personal challenge, and I would think very specifically about that. And if you write it down, and I encourage you to write it down because from a brain research perspective, what we do know is that if you write it down, you will have a much greater chance of remembering it, even if you never look at it again. I suggest that what you think about is what those greatest barriers might be, and then how can you apply what we know about thinking in the brain. You can download the handout from the session. Any other questions that you might have that we haven't had a chance to answer, we'll make sure to do as a follow-up. You've got a full version of the handout in full page format, and then some great white papers that should be very helpful to you as you look at that. And feel free to reach out to us and if you have any other questions. And go forth and be agile. Good luck. Thank you for your time today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ann. It was really, truly a pleasure having you share your expertise with us.
Thank you. It was great fun, and you guys have a great organization. Appreciate your having me.
Great. So this is all the time that we do have for today. As Ann did mention, we have additional resources for you. You have that link there. You will receive that by email as well, so that's easier for you. And if you have additional questions, go ahead and use your chat questions window, send those in to us, and Ann will actually provide some responses to those. We'll email those out to everyone so that you'll be able to see that Q&A as well. We appreciate all of your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.